Nigeria's president recently signed into law an oil overhaul bill that has been in the pipeline for almost 2 decades. Now, this law is seen as historic for Africa's top oil producer, which has seen this natural resource exploited by foreign companies without any benefit to the local communities. Now, the bill was approved by the Senate and House of Representatives. Nigeria's Senate president says communities hosting oil and gas production are the winners.
The host communities are winners as well. It may not be necessarily exactly what some of them had hoped, but you know, from zero to 500 to over $500 million, I think it's a big jump. And with time, such issues could be further addressed. But I want to also caution that it's not the $500 million that is small, but how we are able to prudently and transparently deploy these $500 million in the host communities.
Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Today. I'm your presenter, Mubarak Kenya. Now, this week's edition is focusing on the new Petroleum Industry Act in Nigeria and asking, will the local communities benefit from this long-delayed oil and gas law? In the second part of our program, we shall see how production of clothing, including for high-street brands in Europe and the United States, is killing Africa's rivers through polluting discharges of untreated industrial wastewater. Join us till the end of our show as our guests give us an incisive analysis on these two subjects.
Nigeria's new oil law. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari recently signed the country's much-anticipated petroleum industry bill following nearly 2 decades of attempts and revisions. The new law is expected to overhaul the oil and gas industry in Africa's biggest crude producer. President Buhari said the new oil industry law marks the end of decades of uncertainty and underinvestment in the petroleum industry. He called for the implementation to be completed within 12 months.
I have approved an implementation framework commencing immediately to ensure the industry envisaged in the new law begins to take shape. The implementation process, to be headed by the Honorable Minister of State, Petroleum Resources, is hereby tasked with the completion of the implementation of this Act within 12 months. I am therefore directing all relevant ministries, departments, and agencies of government to fully cooperate in ensuring the successful and timely implementation.
Celebrations over the new oil industry law in Nigeria were dimmed by controversy over the allocation of 3% revenue to host communities in the oil-rich Niger Delta region. Now, some community leaders in the region have rejected the bill, saying they will continue agitating for their rights.
With what they have done, they have not stopped agitation, they have not helped the argument, they have not resolved any conflict, they have created more conflict because the agitation pressure will only be higher.
Now, for more on the new oil industry law in Nigeria, we have contacted Nemo Bassey, an environmental activist and director of health of Mother Earth Foundation. Thanks a lot for your time. Now, can you first tell us what impact will the Petroleum Industry Act have on this critical sector in Nigeria?
So the Petroleum Industry Bill has been in the making for over a decade, and a lot of people are relieved that it has come to be. But it may be a good sign for some investors, but to those of us concerned about the environment, it's not good news at all.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bassey.
The governors of the 36 states of the country, under the auspices of the Nigeria Governors Forum, have described the Petroleum Industry Act as a recipe for disaster. The chairman of the forum, Dr. Kayode Fayemi, has expressed concern over 30% allocation for frontier exploration and the 3% for the host communities.
Our primary concern to me and the people I speak for is the entire Forum of Nigerian Governors. And this is a matter that the entire forum has discussed extensively, and we have come to certain conclusions about what is called frontier funds, whether it is 3% or not. For us, our concern there is that whatever you are taking into these places is a depletion from the Federation account. That money will not go to the Federation account. It would be spread across the few areas that you described as frontier basins, rather than to the entire Federation.
Nigerian governors have particularly rejected the amount to be paid to host communities where oil companies are operating. Can you elaborate on that?
Three major issues include the fact that the provisions made in the bill, in the law for investment in host communities is very disturbing. The communities asked for 10%, while the Senate recommended 3%. The House of Representatives recommended 5%. Eventually, the bill that was sent to the president asked for 10% investment funding for communities where the oil activities are taking place. Now, the major contention on that issue is not necessarily how small the amount is, but the fact that oil companies they are the ones to determine who is a host community, who is a community that has oil facilities, and this excludes communities that just have only the pollution, because the entire region is polluted. Moreover, the oil companies have the upper hand determining who decides what the funding is used for. We think this is very colonial and unacceptable.
Decades of oil spills and gas flaring have transformed the Niger Delta in Nigeria into one of the most polluted places on the planet. A Nigerian boy narrates how his younger brother died after falling into a river contaminated with oil that leaked from a pipeline owned by Shell, Europe's biggest oil and gas company.
My brother fell into the oil one morning. He was 6 years old. I saw oil all over his body. The oil came out from his nose, his mouth, his ears. He swallowed the oil a lot. When we went to the hospital, they could not help him. When we got home, we tried to feed him, but we couldn't help him anymore. He was already dead.
Now, Mr. Bassey, you earlier talked about environmental concerns. Now, do we have provisions in the new law that will ensure multinationals adhere to local laws, especially relating to the environment, and compensation to local communities that have suffered over the years?
Well, the new law is blind to the environment. It's not really concerned about the environment. It's all about the financial management of oil revenue. It's about the investment in the sector. It's about attracting investment. And the only thing that suggests that something may go to the communities is a 3% allocation, 3% of funds from the sector that should go towards the communities. And now this funding is like giving with one hand and taking the same fund with the other hand, because another aspect of the law says that if there's an infringement, if there's maybe an accident along the pipeline, there's oil spill and so on and so forth, and this is attributed to third-party interference, then it means that the communities involved will have to pay for the repair of that situation. What this means is that the oil companies who always attribute any kind of environmental misbehavior to third-party interference, trying to escape their responsibility, would continue to do so, and then the 3% allocation for communities will end up going back to the pockets of oil companies. So we're seeing this as absolutely unhealthy and insensitive.
Well, Nigeria's Dangote oil refinery is expected to buy at least 300,000 barrels per day of the country's crude production. Now, this comes after the government granted approval for a 20% equity purchase in the project promoted by Africa's richest man. Now, the 650,000 barrel per day refinery owned by billionaire Aliko Dangote is under construction in Lagos. The refinery plans to start operations by January. Now, Mr. Basse, there will be increased oil refining in Nigeria following the approval of the new oil law. Now, do you see these impacting negatively on the environment?
Above all, what this means to us, why we're worried about this, it's not about the big private refinery impacting the country negatively, but the fact that you have that big refinery right there at the shoreline of Lagos, you're going to have more pollution, you're going to have destruction of fisheries, you're going to impoverish the people, you're going to poison the people with all the toxic elements coming from the refinery. And then moreover, the country is going to say, well, we have all this oil. Why should we move to renewable energy?
Contrary to expectations that the signing of the Petroleum Industry Act would automatically lead to the removal of fuel subsidy, the federal government of Nigeria says the subsidy will remain until a feasible framework is developed.
The PIB has actually deregulated the sector, but that doesn't mean that there will be an immediate implementation of that price hike, of the deregulation. What the PIB provides is that products will be sold at market dictated prices. So it will not be shouldered by, it will be shouldered by all of us. This is the only fund that is targeted at the host communities in this country. Because all other such funds were not really targeted at the host community. You have the 13% derivation, which was also instituted to douse this problem. And many times, this 13% is not targeted at the host communities. So the 13% may be spent somewhere, and the problem is happening somewhere else.
Of course, most Nigerians are opposed to removal of the fuel subsidy, saying it will push up inflation.
To address some of the controversial details of the new law, our correspondent Folashade Ogurinde tells us more.
Since President Muhammadu Buhari signed the much talked about Petroleum Industry Bill into law, one of the most prominent concerns it has raised is whether or not the pump price of petrol will go up for as high as 300 naira per litre. Usually the impact of fuel price hike is felt first in the public transportation system, where bus operators jack up fares and commuters pay more.
In every way, the driver or every transport company will have to increase the price of or the tariff at which they take to wherever it is that they are going to.
Looking at it, in the other hand, when I buy fuel at the rate of 300 and something naira, I'm likely to increase the transport fare so that I can meet up to go and come and buy the fuel again and go back.
It's going to affect a lot. Not only transportation will affect, it will affect even people selling food stuff. It will affect anything that affects transport, that affects fuel, will affect every other thing.
For a standard living in a common man in Nigeria now, how can you buy fuel for 360 naira and you are receiving a minimum wage of 30,000 naira? Logic, how does that gel? It doesn't work.
The government has decided to maintain the petrol subsidy contrary to expectations. Now, what's your take on this decision?
You know, the question of oil subsidy is one thing that is so opaque that Nigerians don't understand what the subsidy is and where the subsidy comes from. Many times they've told us they've stopped paying subsidies, but then we find that they're still paying subsidies. So it's like there's something political beneath the subsidy argument. And if you ask me, the actual subsidy we have in the oil sector, petroleum sector, is a subsidy provided by the environment that is being trashed, subsidy provided by the communities who are being polluted and contaminated, whose livelihoods are destroyed. And so we just hope that government will wake up one day and tell us exactly how much does the petrol imported or produced locally cost, and how much are we paying at the pump price, and stop playing politics with subsidies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nimo Basse, for your insight on the new petroleum law in Nigeria. Let's take a short break now, and when we come back, we shall talk about global fashion brands polluting African rivers. Stay with us.
Global fashion brands polluting African rivers.
Now, a new report shows that production of clothing, including for high street brands in Europe and the US, is killing Africa's rivers through polluting discharges of untreated industrial water. Now, the report by Water Witness International showcased the polluted rivers in Lesotho, in Southern Africa, and Tanzania to highlight the risks posed by global brands increasingly sourcing clothing from entrepreneurs in Africa, attracted by cheap labor and tax incentives.
Nick Hepworth, Water Witness International manager and author of the report, identified around 50 international brands that source or have purchased their clothes in African countries, including Zara from Inditex, ASOS and H&M. One of the rivers affected by untreated wastewater from factories producing garments for global brands is the Simbazi River that flows across Tanzania's commercial capital, Dar es Salaam. A resident speaks here on how the river has been polluted.
Mwanzo kabisa wakati tunafika Dar es Salaam na kwenye miaka ya 74 mpaka miaka ya 90, mito kama hususan Msimbazi ilikuwa na maji masafi sana. Watu walikuwa wanakunywa yale maji. Lakini kwa ajili ya miundombinu mibovu au matajiri wakubwa waliojenga viwanda wametuchafulia mazingira.
Now, for an incisive analysis on how global fashion brands are involved directly or indirectly in polluting African water bodies in general and rivers in particular, we have contacted Dr. Nick Hepworth, the Water Witness International manager who authored the damning report. Thanks for joining us. Now, can you first tell us why these global brands prefer producing their products in African countries?
Sure. Africa still has just a fraction of the global trade with the fashion market, and it's shadowed by the big producers in Asia. But it's a really important potential driver of job creation and economic growth in Africa. For example, before the pandemic, selling clothes to the global fashion brands was worth about 4.6 billion a year to the African continent. And producers are drawn there by a combination of cheap labor costs and overheads, probably the cheapest labor on the planet, and tax incentives from national governments keen to grow the sector, and favourable trade deals that have emerged over the past few years, which relieve duty on imports from Africa to the US and Europe.
Well, quite unfortunate there that cheap African labor is a major incentive for global fashion brands producing their products in Africa. And I guess that will qualify for modern slavery or neo-slavery.
The European Union has a comprehensive liability regime for damages to the environment based on the polluter pays principle. This legislation has pushed out manufacturers that disregard protection of the environment, forcing them to relocate to third world countries where there are less stringent laws. Why are these fashion brands disregarding the protection of the environment of African countries while they would not dare do the same in Western countries?
Well, many of the fashion brands are outsourcing production to middlemen, to factories which are largely owned by Asian companies across Africa. And again, they play a really important role in generating employment and export revenue. But the brands are also outsourcing pollution and impacts on water, because the regulatory controls that are in place are very weak or not enforced. And so by not enforcing strict standards on their suppliers, the brands are turning a blind eye on the pollution that their production and their supply chains are creating. National governments are often feel as though their hands are tied. They're reluctant to enforce pollution control on factories that employ thousands of people because they fear that the production will simply shift next door.
The United States and the European Union have established programs which give African countries duty-free access to their consumer markets. In a bid to create employment for thousands of their citizens, most of these African countries rush to set up factories with little regard for the environment. The governments of the EU and the US pushed for agreements to produce these garments in Africa. Are they complicit in the destruction of the environment by these global fashion brands?
Absolutely. Just to that point, it's really important, particularly given COVID and the climate emergency, that we do all we can to ensure that everybody has access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene, and is protected from droughts and floods. And the global supply chains and companies and brands producing in Africa have an important role to play. Certainly, the governments that have negotiated improved trade deals have an important role to play to ensure that the companies, the supply chains, and the financiers behind this sector in Africa are compelled to comply with pollution control law and ethical standards of production. And they can do that in a number of ways, attaching disclosure of good performance to the export and import licenses, for example, and enabling companies to be prosecuted and sanctioned for abuse of human rights and water, no matter where they work in the world.
A government can play a critical role if there is political will to implement tough environmental laws that will compel manufacturers to implement good manufacturing practices friendly to the ecosystem. Citizens have the right to water, and factories must be cognizant of this fact. An activist in Tanzania speaks here on the need to protect water from pollution.
Sote tuna haki ya maji safi na salama kwa matumizi ya binadamu na uhai. Tuna wajibu kuhakikisha vyanzo vyetu vya maji havichafuliwi.
Now, what should governments of consumer countries do to ensure that factories producing garments for these global fashion brands do not destroy the environment?
Well, we need to see strong and immediate political leadership to draft and enforce legislation which requires companies to meet basic standards of social justice and environmental protection throughout their supply chains. And also a requirement on the financiers and investments and the banks behind those companies to disclose performance and to divest from companies that continue to abuse water and local communities.
Now, consumers are gradually becoming more engaged in sustainability topics. Many now are demanding that fashion players uphold their social and environmental responsibilities. Now, what's the role of consumers in ensuring that the products they use are compliant to the protection of the environment?
That's a great question. Whether we like it or not, the global markets have a huge influence on the way we use the planet's resources and on communities across the planet. There's a really important role for consumers because markets respond to consumer demand. So we need consumers to step up, to ask questions and demand the responsible use of water in the production of the food, of the clothes, of the computers that they consume. That's what's going to drive change, and that needs to happen and happen quickly.
Well, yes, indeed, there is need for urgent action to be taken to stop the pollution of African waters by global fashion brands. Well, that brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa Today. It's been great having you watching, and please do send us your comments through our social media handle. You can also watch this show on our website at presstv.ir. Thanks a lot for watching, and goodbye for now.